If God knew everything, he would know how to prevent all bad things from happening, right? Well, what if that's not true? What if God knows everything and yet still doesn't know how to prevent evil? Does that even make sense? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. In this series, we've been asking the question, why is there evil? And in this specific section of the series, we're looking at the logical problem of evil, which looks something like this. If God exists, then he could prevent evil because he's all-knowing and all-powerful. If God exists, he would prevent evil because he's all-good. So if God exists, then evil doesn't exist. But evil does exist, therefore God does not exist. Now, this argument fails if either premise 1, premise 2, or premise 4 fail. Now, the only reason that we have to believe premise 1 is for that supporting argument that I sort of gestured at. So let me give you a little bit more technical view of that argument. Assume that God exists. Well, just given what God is all-knowing. But evil is something to know how to prevent. So, therefore, God knows how to prevent evil. God is also all-powerful, and evil is something to have power to prevent. Therefore, God has the power to prevent evil. An agent can prevent something if she knows how to do so and has the power to do so. Therefore, if God exists, God could prevent evil. In this video, we're going to be interested in the first part of that argument, that God is all-knowing, evil is something to know how to prevent, therefore God knows how to prevent evil. Now, 9 follows logically from 7 and 8. You could reject 7, but that goes along with a classic idea of God. It would be hard to understand what God would be in the first place if he wasn't all-knowing, all-powerful, all those things. So if we can, we'd like to avoid rejecting 7. What about that proposition 8 there, though? Today we're going to look at a view called open theism that goes after that proposition right there. And I should say right off the bat that I am not an open theist myself. I have heavy reservations against open theism, but unfortunately in this video, I'm not going to be able to get to them. I am going to do my best to present this view the best I can. And some of the arguments for open theism, I also won't be able to get to because we're going to be looking at a specific problem through the lens of open theism. So we're going to get a really short view of open theism and why you should believe it, and then look at how it deals with this problem of evil, how it rejects this proposition right here, proposition 8. I do eventually want to get into all that philosophical theology. However, it's probably going to take me a long time to get to divine foreknowledge. Having said that, let's check it out. First, let's assume that God's knowledge works the same as our knowledge, only on a much bigger scale. So this will be the first thing that open theism is going to assume. And we'll call that assumption OT1 just so we can keep track of some of these assumptions. If that's the case, omniscience is just knowing everything that there is. So God knows everything that there is right now, right? He permeates the universe and he has total knowledge of all those things. And he did so in all the past moments just like he's doing so right now. So he knows everything that once existed. But, and here's another assumption that open theism is going to make. By the way, I share some of these assumptions with them. So just because I'm saying they're assumptions doesn't mean that they're wrong. But they are things that open theism adheres to that can be questioned. And here's one that I actually share with them that other people will question, which is that the future doesn't exist right now. Again, not every philosopher agrees on this, but open theism assumes this. I agree with them. So if God knows everything that there is, he knows everything that there was, can he know the future? Well, yeah, in the same way that you and I can sort of predict the future by knowing natural laws, right? We can predict the trajectory of, I was going to say an ICBM missile just because that's how I learned trajectory in Air Force Academy. But let's do something a little less horrifying. You can predict where a rock is going to, or how about this? One day I was in Colorado Springs and some of my friends and I were walking up a ramp and I grabbed a snowball. Little did I know that it was really an ice ball, and I chucked it at a friend of mine, a boxer, right? This guy was a trained fighter. Knowing that I have a terrible arm, but I let it go, and I don't know how, but like the arc and just the positioning, I could tell ahead of time, just knowing the law of gravity, I could figure out where that was going to land. And sure enough, it busted this guy right in the eye. I mean, bleeding out of the face, and he was a hothead, right? So right away, as soon as I launched it, I'm looking at it and I'm like, I know exactly where that's going to land. Crap. In the same way, God is going to look at where all the things are physically, is going to know all the natural laws, and is going to be able to calculate perfectly where all those things will go. Just like if you've heard of it, Laplace's demon, which sounds a lot more horrific than it is. It is spelled Laplace, by the way. For years I said Laplace. It's Laplace, apparently. And I know that, quantum mechanics operates probabilistically, but we're worried about the macro level stuff. So at the very least, on the macro level, God would be able to know where every single thing is in the future, right? Well, open theists, along with some other philosophers, will say that there's a special class of events in the future that God can't know. And let me see if I can explain to you why they would say such a thing. Imagine a mad scientist that builds a bunch of robots, designs them, physically puts together the parts, and does the programming also that runs the robots so that they will be killers. And all of a sudden they go off and they destroy the world. Do we blame the robots for what they did? Or do we blame the scientists? Well, we blame the scientists, obviously, right? I mean, the robots had no choice as into what they were going to do. It was the scientists that caused them to do those things, that programmed. The scientists had the choice, and the scientists programmed the robots to do those things. Really, in this case, the robots are more like tools or weapons of the scientists. So as long as the scientists knew what was going to happen, build the robots in those ways, and they don't have any say in the matter, then we blame the scientists. Now imagine that instead of killer robots, the scientist designs killer people. Physically designs these people, and then also designs their psyche and all those things, kind of like, the robot parts and the robot programming. Designs these killer people, they go out and destroy the world. What is the difference between the killer robots and the killer people? Well, it seems like there isn't one, right? It seems like the scientist, the mad scientist, is at fault for doing these things because the robots and the people didn't have a choice in the matter. And of course, God would be analogous to the mad scientist in this way. If God makes us so that our psyche and our physical makeup that we get at birth, if he makes it so that that's going to determine all the decisions that we're going to make ahead of time, sure seems like the mad scientist with the robot. So if we're going to be blamed for anything ourselves, for the things that we do, then open theists believe we're going to have the free will to be able to decide for ourselves, even given our psyche, even given our physical makeup, to decide against what those things would counsel us to do. We can make decisions that are not determined by our makeup. Now, this is a special view of free will called libertarian free will. Of course, I haven't gotten into free will yet, and we eventually will, just like I keep promising you, we'll get into everything. But assumption 3 here for open theists is that libertarian free will is possible. That we can make choices that go contrary to what our bodies and what our brains and what our psychology are telling us. And assumption 4 here is that libertarian free will is necessary for culpability. It's necessary for us to be blamed for the things that we do, that we have this kind of really radical control on the decisions that we make. That's about free will. What does this all have to do with God knowing the future? I was going to use the sea battle example if you know what that is, but let's go back to my buddy Josh, who I hit with the ice ball. When I threw that thing, I knew it was going to hit him. You could say that it's true that it's going to land right in his face. The physical laws and where everything, the facts about where things are, is going to determine that he's going to get hit in the face. Now, I know that Josh is a hothead, right? And I know he's a good fighter. So I might have thought this, Josh is going to charge. That's what I thought. First thing that went through my head is, Josh is going to charge me right now. Now, consider that proposition. Josh is going to charge at me and try to fight. Is that proposition true? Is it true as that ice ball is arcing right to his face? If it is true, can he not charge at me and try to fight me? No, that would make that statement false. So if it's true, then he has to charge at me. Now imagine that God knows ahead of time, as that thing's going in the air, God knows, Josh is going to charge at him and he's going to try to fight him. If he knows that, then that must be true, right? That's a true proposition. So if God knows what we're going to do before we do it, the open theist would say that we have no choice in the matter. We don't have this libertarian free will. If God knows what we're going to do before we choose it, then we have to do it. So, and here's the next assumption for the open theist, is that divine foreknowledge, God knowing what's going to happen ahead of time, prevents libertarian free will, prevents that kind of radical control we might have over our decisions. I know that was a lot, but here's the payoff. According to open theists, God doesn't know future tense propositions that include free will decisions. He doesn't know what you're going to do before you do it. He knows all those other things about nature, right? He knows the physical laws and he can tell all those kinds of future tense things. He knows them, but he doesn't know the decision you're going to make. But the open theist says that doesn't count against omniscience because that's not a thing to know. That's not a thing that exists. It's like saying you don't know what a momrath is. What's a momrath? It was nothing. Then what do you mean? I don't know what it is. What are you even talking about? That is an empty proposition. So God doesn't know what we're going to do ahead of time, and yet he's still omniscient. He still knows all things. What does this have to do with the problem of evil? Well, really, I think that this is more of an argument that open theists are giving to respond to a specific kind of evil that we might blame God for, which is that he makes us do evil things. He makes us already ahead of time, so we are going to sin. That's a specific kind of evil. That's not evil in general. Open theists will go on to argue that we can't blame God for those things because he didn't know what we were going to do ahead of time. In order to give us free will, he couldn't know what we were going to do ahead of time. Therefore, you can't blame him for it. But as an added bonus, since God doesn't know those future tense propositions about what we're going to do, he doesn't know what evil will bring about. So if this is the only kind of evil there is, then God isn't responsible for any evil. Problem of evil solved. In other words, they're rejecting Proposition 8. Proposition 8 said that evil was something to know how to prevent, but future tensed evils, right? Future tensed free will decisions aren't things to know because they just don't exist. And if that's true, then it's not the case that an omniscient being could prevent evil. So the problem of evil fails. Now, this view shares certain things in common with another defense that we'll call the free will defense. The free will defense says that free will is so good, it's something that's so important for us to have, that we're not a bunch of robots, that it was worth God allowing all the evils that were going to happen. God, before he created, looks at the future of creation and says, well, I'm going to give people this free will. Are they going to rob, pillage, steal, create dubstep? Yes, they're going to do those things. But having free will agents is so much better than just programming robots that don't do anything wrong. So yeah, we're going to make these free will guys. The open theist argument against the problem of evil would be somewhat similar in saying that God knows that there's a probability for evil, but that free will that he's giving us is worth that risk of evil. Where the two differ is that the free will defense is going to say that God knows those evil side effects that are going to happen given free will and says that it's worth the free will. Whereas open theist says that free will is good enough to risk the evil side effects. But God doesn't know whether or not those evil side effects will actually happen. So God doesn't know how to prevent those future evils. And as an added bonus, if the reason we are believing in open theism is because of the arguments I was giving beforehand, which don't have anything to do with the problem of evil, would have to do with a specific evil, which is that a God might be blamed for the bad things that we do. If that's why we're believing in open theism, and if that's correct, right, all that stuff's correct, then we go over to the problem of evil. The free will defense has to stand on its own. It has to, you have to make the argument right then and there. The open theist argument is already standing on its own, right? Given that other argument we've given before, we look at the problem of evil and we say, hey, wait a second, we've already got a solution. So assuming the way that I was arguing before for open theism, assuming that works, which again, I don't believe that it does, but assuming that it does, we already have independent reason for believing in open theism. We have a ready-made response to the problem of evil in general. Now, I said the free will defense and the open theist defense both share a little bit in common. They also share some objections. I'm going to save that kind of evaluation for when I actually get to the free will defense in this series. So go ahead and subscribe so you'll be notified when we actually get there. But the biggest objection, which I'm sure that a lot of you guys are already thinking about, is that not all evil is the result of free will. I mean, definitely the bigs, right? Probably the worst, the things we're probably most mad about, like genocide and rape, right? Those things seem to be the result of free will agents. But there are also natural evils and things like earthquakes, cancer, animal suffering. Is there a way to tie all of those things to free will? If the free will defense and the open theist defense to the problem of evil If those two arguments are going to work, they're going to have to be able to tie all of those seemingly unrelated evils back to this one issue of free will. If they're successful, then it seems like this argument will be successful. If not, then it seems like it won't be enough. Will they be successful? Again, stay tuned. Also remember that I noted a bunch of assumptions in open theism that were open to question. Nothing wrong with that, right? In any philosophy, in any philosophical perspective, you're going to have assumptions that are open to question. That's just the nature of philosophy. But I'll put a list of them on my website, so you can go to thephilosopher.com and check out the list there. But now let's look at a few objections to this argument. The first one would be this: that God shouldn't have been gambling in the first place. Maybe God didn't know there would be evil in the future, but at least there was the possibility. And if there was the possibility, God shouldn't have created at all. He shouldn't have taken the risk. Again, I'm not an open theist, but I have to say I disagree with this objection. I mean, just think about parents. We don't know for sure there's going to be suffering in your baby's future. You really know, right? The probability is so astronomical. There will be suffering in your baby's future. And yet, is it the case that you shouldn't have had children? That seems absurd. It seems like bringing these little free will agents into the universe was worth the suffering that they were going to have to go through. Now, if you knew for a fact you were going to have a child and the suffering was going to be so bad for that child, maybe that would be an issue. And to be honest, if that's the case, then this would turn into a problem for the free will defense and not for the open theist defense. Just like the parent would have no idea exactly how bad the suffering would be, the open theist would say that God doesn't have that knowledge, but the free will defense person would say that God does know how bad it would be. It would then behoove the free will defense person to argue that God would not allow such awful suffering, that whatever suffering that there is, that God has some good purpose for. I think a lot of people are going to press this objection and say, well, but what about the gamble with hell? I think this is really what's on most people's mind when they make this objection. God shouldn't have gambled with hell. If he was going to create a bunch of people and he didn't know whether they were going to go to heaven or not, then he didn't know what, free will decision they were going to make, whether they're going to choose heaven, or they were going to reject God and choose hell, then he shouldn't have made them in the first place. Of course, if you're an open theist, you don't have to believe in hell. If you do believe in hell, maybe there's some way that you can make the two things work. I won't explore it that much here, except to say that this is, once again, a specific problem of evil, right? It's not the problem of evil in general. This is the problem of one specific evil. So maybe we can explore the concept of hell in some other series, but this wouldn't be a problem for open theism specifically. It might be a problem for open theists that also believe in hell that don't have some way to make the two make sense together. A further objection that's possible, and remember, when you're looking at open theism's response to the problem of evil, it's not fair to just say these are just all-out objections against open theism. If this were the only reason we had to believe in open theism, then an objection that you could give is it doesn't seem to give us that much of a benefit over the free will argument. The free will argument was that God knew there would be evil and he thought the free will was worth it anyway. The open theist argument would be that God knows that there's a high probability of evil and yet he thinks the free will is worth it anyway. Really, do we gain that much by saying that God does? It seems we lose total foreknowledge of the future, and all we really gain is like this, this little bit of I wasn't sure. It seems like we lost a lot more than we gained there. And a final objection is that if God doesn't know the future, if he doesn't know what we're going to choose, then he really doesn't know how bad it could get. Or I should say that he does know how bad it could get, but he doesn't know how bad it will get. Now, the free will defense guy can sit back and say, well, God looks at the whole future, chooses to create something where free will agents are making decisions and lead to plenty of evil and suffering, and yet overall the good is worth it. But the open theist is going to have to say, well, God looks at the field here and says, yeah, probably this is going to come out well, but I don't know. It seems like taking that gamble is worse than the knowing. So if we're evaluating, which one of these two things would be better for God to do, it seems like creating free will agents where he knows what they're going to do ahead of time would be better than creating free will agents and he has no idea what's going to happen. That's all I have for the open theist response to the problem of evil. If you're still with me, thank you very much, because I know that is a tough topic. It's a lot to get your mind around. But I guess maybe just for a quick review, we'll say that The open theist says it's not the case that God, even though he's all-knowing, would know how to prevent evil, because future free will acts are not something that are determined right now. They're not something that exist. So they're not something that are out there to know. So they don't count against God knowing all things. And therefore, God wouldn't know how to prevent these evils. Again, I know a lot of objections are hanging out there that are waiting for that free will argument. So stick around. We will get to the free will defense and we'll evaluate some of those objections. But as I always say, I think the best philosophy happens in dialogue. So please leave me some comments. Let me know what you think. Let me know any questions that you might have. Tag friends that might be interested in these conversations. That's all I got for today. Adios.